If you don't know what part of your beautiful book should be illustrated and you have a hard time figuring out what each illustration should show, then this video is for you. Hi there, I'm Eevi, an award-winning children's author and ghostwriter over on eevijones.com and the creator of Children's Book University. I create videos specifically for children's authors, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of my videos. In one of my previous videos, I shared how to write an illustrator brief for our illustrators so they know what we are looking for each of our illustrations for our children's book. In that video, I shared what an illustrator brief is and why I think it's one of the most important steps that helps us succeed when working with an illustrator. And I listed the 8 biggest mistakes aspiring children's authors are often making when preparing an illustrator brief. So I went ahead and shared the link to that video in the description below. If you have read my book, How to Self-Publish a Children's Book, you may already know that when it comes to the illustrating of my books, I personally like to predetermine what I would like to see for each of my illustrations. And that's because oftentimes I already have an exact picture of each scene in my mind whenever I'm writing my stories. Now, this of course differs from person to person because we all have different preferences, right? Other authors, for example, might prefer to leave what is being showcased in each of their illustrations completely up to the illustrator. But already having even just a few ideas or images in mind for each scene will always be really helpful, not just to help move the project along much more quickly, but also because by sharing what we would like to see in each illustration, it will be much harder for an illustrator to use AI, artificial intelligence. I shared more about how AI is currently often being used without the consent of the author in my video that talks about how to prevent possible illustrator scams. So if you haven't watched this one yet, make sure you do. I went ahead and copied the link to that video in the description below as well. So if we already have a certain picture in mind, we will want to share that with the help of an illustrator brief. That way our illustrator will know where to begin, even if it's just a more general direction. Keeping all this in mind, the next big question many of my students and clients often have is this: how do we decide what we should have in our illustrations on each page? And that's what we're going to look at next, using a 3-step process I've been putting together over the years. Step 1 is to break up our story. In order to plan our illustrations, we first need to figure out what part of our story is on what page. And so here's my very first ninja tip when it comes to breaking up our text. Something we will want to pay attention to is to ensure that our text is somewhat evenly distributed throughout our pages. And that's because we want to make sure the time spent on each page is about the same throughout the book. So for example, something we wouldn't want is to have one page that is filled with text from the top to the bottom, while the next few pages have very little or no text at all. What we are looking for is balance here, because especially with picture books for younger kids, we don't want to have to stay too long on one page, because that's when our little ones may get a little antsy. And so to ensure that balance, we will want to break up our text somewhat evenly. And one of the best ways to do that is to make use of 2 variables. 1, the average page count of books that are similar to ours or of books that are written for the same age group, and 2, the word count of our story. Because it's those 2 variables, our page count and our word count, that can really help guide us here. Now here it's important to remember that our recommended page count and our recommended word count both greatly depend on the age group we have written our story for. It always comes back to the age of our little readers. So if you need any help determining the age group your beautiful story should be for, how many pages your book should have, and how long or short your story should be, I have a separate video on all of these, so I made sure to share the links to those in the description below, because we really do want to make sure our stories are written in such a way that they appeal to our special target audience. Now, if we want to just get a rough idea on how long our book should be in terms of the page count and the word count, we can use my new calculators I created specifically for us children's authors over on my site. On my age range calculator, all we need to do is enter the word count of our story, and it will show us the ideal page count along with the ideal age group. And we can also use my word count calculator by selecting it in the top menu bar. Here, all we need to do is enter the age we would like our story to be for, and it will show us the ideal page count again, along with the ideal word count for that specific age. These calculators are quite new and so much fun, so I made sure to share the link in the description below. But please remember, these are just guidelines. These are not definitive numbers. Once we know the word count of our story and the average page count, we can simply divide our word count by our page count, and that will give us the general number of words to have on each page if we are looking to break up our story evenly. So let's say we have determined that our story for 2 to 5 year olds that is 600 words long should ideally have a page count of 32 single pages. Then our words per page would be 600 words divided by 32 single pages, which is around 19 words per page. Now this may seem really low, but looking at it as an example, we will see that it actually is not. Here we have those 19 words on each single page like we see it here in the left example. Alternatively, we could also place these words on just one page for a double spread the way we see it here in the right example. Here we would have 2 times 19 words now, so a total of 38 words on that double spread. Now it's really important to remember that our calculated words per page are really just meant to be a guide. It's not meant to be a hard set rule at all. This is not the only way to break up our text, because displaying our text so that it makes sense is absolutely more important. So thinking in terms of scenes can be really helpful here. So looking at our story, we will want to try to find mini scenes or natural breaks that would roughly align with our determined guiding word count. So for our example of the 32 single pages or 16 double spread pages, we would want to try to find equal parts of text that we can display on our 16 double spread pages. Once we have broken our story into little scenes like this, we are now ready for step 2. And that's where what is called a book dummy comes in. That's something I also shared in my book, How to Self-Publish a Children's Book. A book dummy is essentially like a very simple mock-up of the pages and layout of our book. It is meant to help us visualize where what part or scene of our story is being displayed. I have written, co-authored, and ghostwritten over 60 children's books and still use some type of book dummy to this day. It's so helpful. So if you haven't yet, I encourage you to give it at least a try. There are 2 types of book dummy mock-ups that I like to use. 1, an actual physical mock-up of my book, and 2, a digital mock-up version. When I wrote my very first children's book over a decade ago, I created an actual physical mock-up, and all I did here was I took 10 to 15 pages, folded the stack in half to create a book, and placed a rubber band in the middle to hold the pieces of paper together. An even simpler version of such a book dummy is a digital version, and that's what I am using now whenever I am at the stage of the creation process, whether that's for my own books or for my clients. I simply create a table within Word or Google Docs with 2 columns and the number of rows that corresponds to the number of determined double spreads from our previous step. The 2 columns represent the left and the right side of my book, while the rows represent the different pages as a double spread. Both the physical as well as the digital version are a great way to get started with the ideation for the illustration for each scene. Either one will work. And all we have to do is simply take those short little scenes of our story we determined in step 1 and distribute them one at a time to the different pages or cells of our book dummy. So in the end, we will know exactly what part of our story will be on what page. Once we have set up our book dummies this way, we are ready for step 3, where we get to plan out our illustrations for each of our mini scenes. And that's where the fun part begins, because we now get to decide what illustration might go really well with those little mini parts or scenes of our story. And so here's where my second ninja tip comes in. When it comes to finding fun and creative ideas for each of our illustrations, it's really helpful to think of each as a snapshot of a specific moment of our story. So looking at the text that will appear on any given page, what would be a fun and interesting snapshot that would visually complement this particular part of our story? So let's look at 5 different examples of how to essentially translate our text into illustrations. The first example is the easiest and most obvious one. If our text describes a certain action, then that's what we would want to show. That's usually the literal visual translation of our text. For example, if our text says, "Sam is digging in the sand while Tom painted a ferocious dinosaur," then we would show just that in our illustration. Now, sometimes our text doesn't really describe or have such an obvious action, and it is more about an idea, and that's what our second example is about. So for example, in my book, Sometimes It Rains, one of the pages reads, Sometimes I can't have what I want right away, but must patiently wait until just the right day, and that's okay. Here, the main idea is to patiently wait, right? So then here, we could ask ourselves, how can we portray this idea of waiting patiently? What would little ones identify with being patient? What would that mean to them? And what I came up with was to show a little girl looking through a window of a toy store where she is looking at a specific toy, because that's something little ones are really familiar with, right? A toy they might really want, but that they might not get in that very moment. Sometimes a particular part of our story we want to show in our illustration is more about an intangible concept, and that's our third example. This here is another example from my book, Sometimes It Rains. Sometimes I'm not quite old enough for movies, rides, and other fun stuff, and that's okay. Here the main idea is not being old enough. So we could ask ourselves, how can we portray an intangible concept of not being old enough? What is something that little ones could identify with here? And so what I came up with here was to show a little girl in front of a Ferris wheel next to one of those measuring scales to see if kids are tall enough to go on the rides, but then to have that girl not be tall enough, because we often associate height with a certain age, right? So whatever we are deciding to show in our illustration is very much more symbolic in nature here. So when it comes to finding ways to visually bring across certain ideas and concepts like this, the key is to try to come up with scenarios that little ones can identify with, things they know and are able to relate to because it's something they may have experienced before. And this also holds true for feelings, which is our fourth example. If we want to show specific feelings, we will want to do so by showing scenarios we know little ones may be familiar with. In my book, Cookies and Love, which I wrote as a sweet little love note to all our beautiful grandmas and grandpas, I wrote these lines right here. You're there for me, watch out for me. You unfailingly go beyond and above. Forevermore, I love you. For your unending hugs, cookies, and love. This isn't a children's book per se because it's meant to be gifted to our grandmas and grandpas, either our own or our kids' grandparents, but it's a great example. When it comes to showing emotions and feelings, my ninja tip here is this. Go beyond just facial expressions. Showing our characters' emotions and feelings with facial expressions alone is hard, especially when it comes to emotions that are a lot more nuanced. It's much easier to show our big emotions like being sad, happy, upset, or tired, but it's much harder to show more subtle emotions like surprise, pride, or embarrassment. For those more subtle emotions, it's always helpful if we can show a surrounding environment. So if we want our characters to show certain emotions, we shouldn't just confine this to their facial expressions. Instead, we can try to make use of our character's body posture and place the characters in a scene that would support that emotion we are trying to show. And that's what we can see in this illustration of this page right here. And finally, example 5 is all about keywords and latching onto them. This is really helpful if our text doesn't really have an action or feeling or idea per se. If that's the case, I would be looking for keywords. So let's look at an example from my book, Letting Go, which I wrote for empty nesters whose kids either have left for college or have just moved out to begin their next beautiful phase in life. Again, it's not a children's book per se because it's meant to be gifted to empty nesters, but it's a great example. Here this page reads, no one prepared you for the changes she'd bring into your life. Countless worries, doubts, lost sleep, the tears you may have cried. Yet her happiness, her wins, her joy in life repaid tenfold 1,000,000,000 of sacrifices made. So when I was trying to come up with an illustration idea for this page, I quite literally latched onto the word win. And so this page shows the main character with her friend right after they had won a soccer game. This page and this entire book really makes use of a number of other visual storytelling techniques as well. And I shared some of these in my other video I made on how to make our illustrations more interesting. So I made sure to share that video in the description below as well. In either one of these examples, it's important not to use the same setting over and over again. So if 3 consecutive illustration ideas involve the exact same setup, we should ask ourselves, how can I change the perspective? How can I show the same or similar scenes differently? How can I make it more interesting? Perhaps we could zoom in and show more details, or we could zoom out and show a bigger picture, or we could change the angle or perspective. I love putting together my illustrator brief. It's the author's opportunity to share what they have been envisioning when they were writing their beautiful story. Of course, we still want to give the illustrator enough creative freedom to explore the different possibilities for each illustration, because they too have so much to bring to the table. But by having our own vision and by sharing it with them, we get to guide them, and we help and support them to make our story come to life visually. I so hope that with the help of this video, you now know how to go about deciding what text and what illustration should be on each of your pages in your beautiful children's book. Please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't yet. It really encourages me to keep making free videos for you just like this one. Here's to making our story come to life visually. Bye!